President Javier Milei was interviewed at AynRandCon in Buenos Aires on April 6th, a conference co-hosted by ARI. How did the event go? What were its goals? And what are some takeaways? I'm Elan Journo. Joining me today is Onkar Ghate. Onkar, let me start with you. What is your top-line assessment of how things unfolded at the event?
I think overall, well, it's worth saying I wasn't at the event. You weren't at the event. So we're watching a recording of it. It's the interviews in Spanish. We're listening to an interpreter doing simultaneous presenting what he's saying in English. So I'm going off of that. And I don't speak Spanish, so I can't. But I thought overall it didn't really work for what we were trying to do, and that if you're just watching this as a standalone event, it comes across too much like we're endorsing him as a politician or a political figure. And I think he's interesting as a political figure, but just ARI isn't. I mean, for starters, isn't in the business of endorsing political candidates, or in this case, it's someone who's elected but is continuing to run for election. That's part of what he talked about in the interview elections in 2025. And that's not what we're in the business of doing. So it came across, I think, if you watch it as a standalone thing, not as part of a whole conference. So the part of the whole conference, there was discussion of issues in which we disagree with Milei. There was discussion of abortion, discussion of how properly to think about freedom, rights, individualism, government, anarchy. So that if you were at the conference, you would have heard many other things. But here's just an interview of a president. And I thought it came across, I found the interview interesting, actually, but still that it comes across as we're sort of endorsing his position or him as a political figure. What was your overall impression of?
Yeah, I was disappointed. From one perspective, I thought it could have gone very badly, much worse than the way it did go. And so I was bracing for that. It didn't turn out that way, but it was still disappointing based on what we had hoped to do. And I think maybe that's the first point to start with. So what were our goals in doing this, and what was the relationship between the Institute and the event and the invitation that went out to President Milei? Maybe that's where we should start our conversation. And I think the other thing you said is worth front loading too, which is that he is an interesting person. He is an interesting politician, and that was part of the thinking behind how this came to be. So my understanding, and you fill in the pieces I'm missing, or if I'm not getting exactly the details, but my understanding is that we had put on an event in I think Buenos Aires or other parts of Latin America since 2019, encouraging people to come and learn more about Ayn Rand's ideas. We've had an Ayn Rand Con in Latin America for a long time, an annual event. And this year, once the event was already in place, our partner organization led by Maria Marti put the invitation out to Javier Milei. So the event was already on the books, and he had become a very notable public figure, president of the country, and I think there was some personal relationship in the background that led to that invitation. And that was announced a couple of weeks back before the event took place. And I think it's useful to talk more about how we thought of this going in, and what's interesting about him. Why would it be interesting to have a conversation with him? Because there are a lot of politicians in the world, and you could do that for any event. So what do you find interesting about Milei? How did you think about the goal for having him in the event?
I mean, there's many things interesting. I think one of the things that has stood out, and why the Argentinian elections and now the Argentinian political scene is getting coverage around the world. Like, that's not normal. That's not what usually happens with the politics uh, in the country. So what's so unusual is you have a figure who describes himself as a libertarian, as free market, being elected in, of all places, Argentina, in Latin America. So that of itself it surprised, I think, most political analysts that he was elected. That's very interesting. And then the fact that he actually talks about ideas. So he talks about free markets, some of the ideas behind them. Just in this interview that happened at the conference, I mean, he brought up Marx, some of the early Austrian economists, like in the Austrian School of Economics, Menger and others. He brought up Karl Popper. It's a politician here, the president of the country, who actually talks about ideas. And if you think of the U.S. scene, you can count on one hand, and maybe you don't even need all five fingers, of the number of US politicians who actually talk about ideas in a way that you think. He brought up Israel Kirzner, who I think is who's a student of Ludwig von Mises, and I think of it as like the best Austrian in that generation of students. He brought up Kirzner. He mentioned Kirzner's book. And from what he said of it, it actually seems like he's read it. And if you contrast that to, say, Trump, who will mention various things, the fountainhead, he's mentioned the Bible, but you have the sense that he has never opened the page of it. So that you have a politician who's talking about ideas, that's also interesting. And so the initial idea was to have a conversation about ideas at the conference and have Elan, who was speaking at the conference, chairman of the board of ARI, to be in a conversation with Milei. So that was the original, to have a conversation about ideas. And part of what would have surfaced for sure in that conversation is both some points of real or seeming agreement, but also points of real disagreement, and of why we take the positions we take. And we also learn more about why Milei takes some of the positions that he seems to be taking.
Yeah, I should add that one reason we wanted to debrief the event is that the plan that you're describing isn't the plan that actually happened. It was an interview with Maria Marti, and we'll talk more about that. The other reason is I think we were going to debrief it whichever way it played out. But the other thing that happened over the weekend is that either Milei or someone in his office released the video of the interview, which is in Spanish, and I think you can find it with probably subtitles if it's on YouTube. I don't think we have any plans to release it. I didn't, as I said, I was disappointed by the event as compared to the goals we had. We're not going to play any clips because one reason for that is it's in Spanish and there's a voiceover of the interpreter and it's hard to follow. I mean, we both watched it with that format, and I don't want to people can go and find it. It's easily on the web, on Twitter, and I think it's on YouTube already. And maybe you can watch it with subtitles, which is probably easier than listening to the interpreter voiced over the original Spanish. But in any case, people should go watch it just to see what he has to say and how it turned out. It's just not practical to include clips in our conversation here. So let's talk about so we had a vision of what it would be, a conversation that would bring up important issues, an engagement with someone who I think there's strong evidence to think that he's actually read a lot of the books he's talking about, and the thinkers have really shaped his views, because it's not just he's mentioning these authors. You can see it in the kind of positions he's taking and the arguments he makes. And he does make arguments, which is another feature of his persona that I think is distinctive compared to other politicians. So that wasn't appealing, and what ended up being agreed to is a conversation, an interview with Maria Marti, who heads up the Ayn Rand Center Latin America, with Javier Milei on stage. And the conversation there is, I think the goal for that conversation was that it would be about eliciting what his positions are, just to understand the Milei phenomenon as I think of it. So he's, as you said, brought Argentinian politics to the world stage. There's a lot of attention on him in particular, a lot of attention on Argentina, and particularly its economic struggles, which he has won elections on the strength of trying to solve. And so I think the goal was to bring out some of those issues of how does he think about them? How does he think of the criticism of his work? What are the challenges he's facing? Because if anything, it is, I think one of the things he says in the interview is, it's really hard to do what I'm doing. No one's tried to do this. And he also cautions his audience, when you're criticizing, you recognize the challenges, in effect. So I think he's starting to recognize it maybe more so than he did before. So that's what the interview actually is about. And again, I wish there were more points of challenge, and maybe it's a difficult thing to do when you're interviewing a head of state. I don't know how it would unfold otherwise. So there's things about the phenomenon that he is at the center of that's interesting to explore. And I had hoped that the interview would do that. I don't think it really succeeds in doing that. Just to give a summary of how I experienced it, a lot of it sounded like the positions you hear him present in a lot of interviews. It wasn't unique to this forum. Things that are his, I don't know if it's fair to call it a stump speech, but the kind of his top priorities came up, and in that sense, there was not that much that was new that you couldn't find out anywhere else or in other statements of his. Uh, there are other things we should come back to that you mentioned to me before, while we were preparing for today, that you found interesting, and I think that would be good to come back to. So we talked about what the goal was and what it actually turned out to be, and you mentioned that had it been the conversation we aimed at with Yaron Brook on the other side of the conversation, bringing up points of difference, maybe getting more into the ideas, more deeply into some of Millei's thinking, I think what it would have brought out, as you mentioned, was significant points of contrast. And I think that was something I was hoping to hear more about from Millet, how his view of abortion, which is a very strange view. It's not just because God told you that life begins at conception. He has a view about what's pushing the pro-abortion rights position, which he talked about in a speech. I think this was at the CPAC speech he gave here in the United States a few months back, which is a really unusual position. I would have wanted to hear some challenge to that, because I don't think that's really what's driving pro-abortion. But it was not even the best argument for abortion. So that's one issue. And then I think one question mark which we should come back to is he has described himself as an anarcho-capitalist. And in fact, he has this, he's a cosplay enthusiast. So he dresses up in a costume. He has this persona called Captain ANCAP. I don't know if he still does this, but he associates himself with this position. So one question I would have wanted to hear from him is, what does it actually mean to him to be an anarcho-capitalist? Is he really convinced of the arguments that people make in favor of anarchy? And what does he say to the rebuttals to? I think the rebuttals to the arguments for anarchism are very strong and in fact defeating. So I would have loved to hear that. There's many things I would have wanted to hear, including his justification for capitalism on moral grounds. Uh, the list is very long, and I think it could have been an incredibly fruitful conversation had it reached that level of depth. And one of the things that I think there was room to talk more about, even in the interview format, was his plan to deal with inflation, which I think is the top issue, one of the top issues he's actually campaigned on. And I've read enough to understand that that's not going as well as I think he hoped it would have. And it's a difficult thing, even if he's touting, here are the things I've done so well in the first 100 days or so. So that's part of why I think of it as a disappointing opportunity missed, in effect. Any other thoughts from you on this?
And another way of thinking about it is, so there's issues of disagreement, points of contrast, but part of the reason to do something like this was to expose him more to Ayn Rand's ideas and way of thinking. Like, I think it's clear there's been some influence of Ayn Rand on his thinking, but you and I both know people can read Atlas Shrugged or The Virtue of Selfishness or Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal, and not get the essence of what Ayn Rand is saying, arguing, the reasons for the positions she's taking. And so part of it is just food for thought. Like, if you have a real conversation about ideas, it's and issues, say, of abortion or anarchism came up. The way Ayn Rand thinks about these are different from how everybody else thinks about them. Even if you're on the side, like the pro-abortion side, or pro-abortion rights side, Ayn Rand has very unique things to say about how to think about abortion, and if you're an individualist, what it means, what this whole issue means. She thought it was a very significant issue politically, and the same for the issue of anarchy. It's not just that she thinks it's wrong. She has very distinctive things to say about that. She viewed it as this historically comes from the left and should be viewed still as belonging to the left on the side of statism and collectivism if you're an advocate of anarchy. And that is, I mean, I've dealt and been in circles with libertarians. So that often comes as a surprise to them that she not just thinks they're wrong. She thinks you're a statist and a collectivist if this is what your position is. And that's if that kind of conversation goes well, that's real food for thought of a person who's thinking. And there's evidence. Again, I don't read Spanish. I don't follow Argentinian politics in the way that I follow, say, U.S. politics. So I have a distance from it, and there may well be things that I have not seen and not understood. But from what I've seen, there is some real engagement with ideas on the part of Milei, that it doesn't all seem an act in the way that you can look at a politician, even when they seem to be talking about ideas. It's all just, oh, it seems to have an effect on the audience, so I'll say it, but I don't actually think about this when I'm not in front of the camera or the microphone. And I don't get that sense with Milei, that there's some actual thinking there. And that's part of the reason that one would be interested in having a conversation, but a real conversation about ideas.
Yeah, I think that would have been fruitful. But let's talk a bit about Millet and why he's getting so much attention. So we touched a bit on this at the beginning of the conversation, and I think there'll be things to say about what come up, points that come up in the conversation. And again, I recommend that people who want to hear him explain his position in his own words should go watch the recording that's been released. We'll mention some of it and we'll put in our own terms and relate his positions as far as it's relevant. But let's talk a bit about why he's gaining so much attention. What do you see? So you mentioned some aspects of him that I think of as positives, that there's evidence to think he's actually read a lot of these books, he's internalized some of these arguments, and he's not voicing positions because they're politically expedient. He's voicing them because he thinks he believes in them, and that there's some level of understanding, and that I think that I remember reading that he did one degree, a graduate degree in economics, and then he did another one. That's when he encountered new ideas that changed his views, and so he talks about that as a turning point in his intellectual development. And that seems like it actually tracks his trajectory. So let's talk a bit about that. What do you see as things that are significant positives or moderate positives? How do you understand him?
Yeah, from what I've seen, there's real positives and there's real negatives. And so an assessment, even if overall you have a positive assessment, you have to think about and acknowledge the whole package. And then again, from the point of the interview, like, you don't get any of that. Even like if you were trying to form a view of Milei, here's things. That's why you want some of the range of the things he thinks about and what he has to say about these. But the positive is, and thinking of positive of him elected, is there's a real economic agenda here that I think is essentially positive. That is, there's Argentina is in the midst of an incredible inflation, and the long term downward economic spiral, and a perspective that we have so many regulations that strangle producers. So there are government controls that don't accomplish anything positive. They're complete negatives. They strangle production, ability, the people who want to work and build. That's right in regard to what has happened in Argentina. And so that there's a real program of what will be called deregulation. That's a positive, and to sell state enterprises, but to remove all kinds of controls over. One of them, I think, was proposed in these kind of executive orders, is there's controls up to the level of what grocery stores can sell and how they have to display it. So it's we're talking about a very controlled economy. There's I think a real emphasis and program to want to deregulate, to abolish these regulations that are crippling the economy, and to combat inflation. Probably the most significant thing is a promise to dollarize the economy, which will take the dollarize it means the currency in which transactions and commerce will take place will be the US dollar, not the peso. And that removes from government the power to just print money, and that's what leads to the inflation, to the devaluing of the currency. They won't have that power because they won't have power over the currency, because the U.S. government has power over the U.S. dollar. And that, as like, these are what I'm running on. This is what I want to do, and I think it's right to think that he was elected for his economic program, not for the other things that he says, some of which are deeply problematic and deeply worrying. But I don't, again, I might have a different view if I do all the details of what's going on and read Spanish, so that, because I often, when people tell me, oh, did you see this? And this is what the story amounts to. When I go read it or read somebody's speech, I think, no, that's not what's being said. So I would want a real firsthand knowledge here, which you really need to speak Spanish in order to have that. But so going on it from that kind of outsider's perspective, my impression is it's for the economic issues that he's been elected. I think that's important. He has a, from what I've heard him say about abortion, it's awful. But I don't get the sense he was elected because of his position on abortion. And if I thought that would be, the phenomenon would be different. But I think the phenomenon is Argentina's in economic crisis, and here's a person who has actual views of what a solution would be, and they're broadly along the right lines.
And it's a solution that I don't think has been tried. So it's not a tweaking of at the margins. It's, we need to wholesale deregulate. We need to move away from government's intervention in the economy, which I think that's part of what makes it fresh and different in that space. I want to pick up on your observation on where abortion fits into his positioning. I think we were talking about this in another context, and I'm curious if your view is the same or if it's changed. But it's striking to me that if abortion, it, I think it's right now it's legal in Argentina, and I think what he's pushing or his party is pushing, it's a question of it, how much of it is coming from him, but a move to make it harder to get abortions, if not make it illegal. And if that is something that he's elevating in the context where the country is being ground down by inflation at a rate that is just hard to fathom. Like we have inflation here in the US, and people are talking about what the price of groceries, but in Argentina, it's crazy, the level of inflation. So how do you understand the role of abortion given the gargantuan task he faces on the economy? How does that fit in? Or maybe there isn't enough to say about that, but that seems, that strikes me as a sore thumb sticking up that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, so that's part of what's very worrisome about it. Like, I have a big question mark on the issue of abortion. It seems you could say from a personal level, he's against abortion. But how much is it that he wants to bring that into politics? And that's what I have a question mark about. But a question mark is like a real question mark about, is this something that's part of the political agenda? And that if his party grows in seats and power, yeah, this is what we want to bring as part of the legal changes, and that would be, a horrible event if that happened. Latin America seems to be moving finally in a direction that there's a little more recognition for the right to abortion, and that's a positive. And to take it in the opposite direction would be really, really bad. So, and the part of the reason it's a question mark is he does bring it up in some of his political speeches. So you brought up the CPAC, the talk he gave recently, and yeah, it comes up at the end. He thinks of the. You said he has seems to have a strange or idiosyncratic view about it. He thinks of abortion as belonging on the left as and part of the attempt at population control. And if you know, in the 60s and 70s, there was a real push of liberals and the left leaning about we're going to die from overpopulation. We have to have population control, which means the government has to control population. So there is that kind of view. I don't think the right to abortion and Roe v. Wade or something like that, you can plausibly fit that into it was an issue about population control. So there's an element that it seems like, given that he hates the left, anything that they seem to do, and if they're on the side of abortion and Roe v. Wade, I'm going to oppose it. That's not good a way to form any idea or opinion. But the fact that he brings it up in a political speech suggests that it's more than just a personal issue, and that it would be better if abortion were banned. And that is very worrisome if that is part of his political agenda. I mean, it's really, really bad if it is.
Yeah, I wonder, again, I'm in the same position as you are. I don't have Spanish. I can understand some of it, but very rudimentary. It's not enough to understand what he's saying, and it's not a first-hand understanding of the situation. And I don't follow Argentinian politics either. One of our colleagues does, but even then, I think it's a real challenge to form a view. The other thing I was going to say, just in passing, about the speech he gave at CPAC, which I think people who are trying to form a view of Milei and the phenomenon, as we are, because this is something we've been thinking about for a while since it became prominent. I watched that, and I thought, again, the abortion position he takes, you've already commented on, but it comes up not really in any logical way, given what he says in the first 3/4 of the talk. And those 3/4 of the talk are also strange for different reasons, in that it's economic argumentation, quite intricate economic argumentation, which I think is well beyond the audience's ability to comprehend. And whoever goes to CPAC, I don't think it's mostly economics graduate students, and I think you probably need advanced level knowledge of economics to follow what he's saying. And I don't know even if what he's saying is accurate of the positions he's describing. So it just seemed like a really disconnected talk, given the setting and the opportunity. And I'm interested in communication because of the work that I do, but it struck me as really an odd choice to make, considering, and this is the contrast, when he went to Davos to give a speech, that was much more intelligible. This is sort of his position. He's going to stand against the conventional establishment and make his stand, and articulating his views. But the CPAC speech was strange and concerning in being disconnected from the audience he's trying to reach. I'm wondering if you had a similar reaction to that.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction to watching the CPAC speech, and I have a little bit of a background in economics. I studied; it was part of a double major as undergraduate, and so I knew some of the things he's talking about. But yeah, my view was the audience has no idea what he's talking about. But I forget, was this? I watched a bunch of interviews of Milei yesterday, including the one at the conference. So, but I think this came up at the conference, but I might be misremembering. So correct me if you don't remember this from in the interview. But he said he did this at in political rallies during the campaign, that he would be, and people said, well, this will be impossible. At most, you'll get 4,000, 5,000. Like, that's a great turnout. And if you start talking about Hayek and Kerzner, things like that, everybody's going to tune you out. And part of what he said was, well, no, I was getting 15, 20,000. And I was talking about these kinds of issues, and he seemed to know, like, yeah, at some level, it's a disconnect with the audience can't really follow it. But on the other hand, there seemed to be a kind of view, but what it communicates is I take these ideas seriously. This is what I'm talking about. This is what's informing my view of what we need to do economically. And this is what I know, and this is what I'm going to talk about. So in that sense, it seemed like part of it was I'm not going to just do what politicians so often do, is just pander to you, tell you what I think you want to hear. I have no intention in carrying through in this. It doesn't even represent my views, and so they say different things to different audiences. So in that sense, that helped me, that maybe CPAC was just treating in the same kind of way. I'm going to talk about what I talk about, even though there's a way in which it is disconnected from what the audience actually knows and probably what the audience is expecting. And so that it helped me put it in a context. Okay, so it's like he has some awareness at least. So because I watched the CPAC and I wondered, like, does he have an idea that he's not talking to economics students and then they're not following most of what he's saying? And here it was, yeah, okay, he has an idea that that's what's happening.
Let's talk a bit about some of the other issues that would have come up in conversation, including discussing his agenda.
Yeah. Before we turn to that, what you brought up about the mysticism, part of the reason that matters politically is, and particularly when you're talking about someone who's in the executive branch of government, they have to make decisions all the time. And it goes to what that process of decision making looks like. And how much is it that a person's kind of mystical religious views are more personal to them? They're bracketed when they're functioning in their official capacity. And I mean, we've both met many people, including businessmen, and in different fields. I mean, I've even met doctors who I think, and will say they're religious and so on. And there's an aspect about their life that I think is, that they're not functioning rationally there. And yet you can still think, but as a surgeon, they are rational, and they're compartmentalized in that kind of way. And is it that's what the phenomenon is in regard to Milei, or in major decision making, is there going to be an element of real mysticism often involved? And the more you think that, in terms of someone, as I say, especially, well, I would say the executive branch, the judicial branch as well. If you think judges are making decisions like this, a legislature, hopefully the other people in the legislature will say, well, that's not a basis for proper legislation. And they can discard that in the way for an executive or someone who has that kind of decision-making power. You really have to worry about that. And that's why that's a real issue that one has to think about in terms of thinking about him as a political figure.
I suppose one example in the US context is the push against abortion rights, that we've seen in the last decade, that culminated in the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and then the reductio ad absurdum of treating IVF embryos as if they're people or they're children. So, and I think that can only be explained by a religious mentality. It's not based on fact, and I think that's I think a useful illustration of some of what you're raising. So let's turn to some of the other aspects of what I think would be interesting to talk to him about, things to challenge him on, things to just learn more about how he thinks. And you mentioned, we talked quite a bit about abortion as a question mark. How does it relate? Is it compartmentalized? Is it really central to his view? The other issue that's come up is the military draft. And I'm really passionate about the military draft for a number of reasons. And I think it's one of the most evil things that a country can do to its own people. It is just psychologically, for the best people who have ambitions, it's stultifying, and it's terrible. And then when you think about what it means to be drafted into a military and then put in harm's way when you have no choice about it, and it's for possibly in conflicts you don't agree that the country should be involved with, it really takes your control over your own life away from you, and at the risk of death. Basically, it puts you in harm's way uh, without any consideration of your interests, your thought, your life. And I think Ayn Rand was really eloquent in articulating her view about why the military draft is so evil, and she was opposed to it here in the United States when it was in place. And she regarded it as a statist policy, as fundamentally contradiction with the principle of individual rights. And I think, and this is why I think it's significant to talk to Javier Milei about it, because one of the things he's championed is the idea of property rights and rights in general. So he stands for rights. He thinks they're important to a society's success. And I wonder if he sees the contradiction. And that would be a question to put to him. So, on the one hand, you want the government to respect rights, including property rights. How can that be done at the same time that your government's pushing to enact military draft? That's a direct and obvious contradiction. How do you reconcile those two? Uh, I'm just I'm curious how where you see this fitting into his approach.
Yes, the and what I would emphasize in regard to the military draft, and the context here is that it's been floating around since he assumed the presidency, and some of the people who have brought in to form the government, that there's some kind of push that it would be good to have a military draft, conscription. It will help boost Argentina, help boost the nation. The military draft, that when we're talking about conscription, so you're forced against your will to be part of the military, is straightforward collectivism. And part of his political image is, I'm fighting collectivism. So one of the ways the question I think should be asked is, you say you're an opponent of collectivism, but doesn't that entail that you have to be an opponent of the military draft? That the whole premise of the draft is you as an individual and your own individual life and goals, they don't count if the nation needs you. And so the nation can conscript you into supposed defense of the nation. But when you have a draft, it's so often then you have wars that are not in defense, they're aggressive wars. And it's because we have to build up our nation or the prestige of the nation. There's even kinds of views that war is a good tonic, that because people learn to do their duty, and that, yeah, you are subordinate to the nation and you should serve. And if we make you fight in a war and so on, that really drives home the lesson that you as an individual is not what's paramount. It's the nation as a whole that's paramount. So the military draft is straightforward collectivism. And nobody who thinks of themselves as an opponent of collectivism can be on the side of a military draft. So and that's actually true of abortion as well. But it's more here, the abortion, it's religious dogma and religious dogmatist then saying, this is our dogma, this is what we say our holy book says, and we're going to impose it on everybody else. So it's not just, okay, we won't have abortions and so on. It's nobody can have abortion. So they're imposing their collective will, in this case their collective irrationality, on everybody. So both are forms of collectivism. And one of the things that to really press on is, can you really honestly say you're on the side of individualism and against collectivism if you're willing to accept, tolerate, or in the case of abortion, promote that, oh yeah, like abortion should be outlawed, we should have a military draft? Then you're putting yourself on the side of collectivism, not individualism. And how do you, I mean, if you're having a real conversation, is how do you think of it that like something like the military draft isn't on the side of collectivism?
I want to circle back to the issue of anarchy or anarcho-capitalism, as Millet describes himself as supporting, and try to unpack a bit about what's really going on here. And one question to put is he in favor of it because of the arguments that are being put forward for anarchism, which is one interpretation of this. How much of it is feeding into his policies? Is it really driving his policies? Another aspect is it part of a reaction to illegitimate government power? And so it's, and he's actually said his, I don't know how much he believes this, but he said that he regards all government as a criminal enterprise. It's theft, and he seems to have a very negative view of government per se in any form, regardless of what limits there might be on its power. So I'm curious how that fits into his view, or your understanding of his view.
Yeah, I mean, that's again something that it would have been good if there were interview or conversation questions about this, because it's again something that I have a big question mark around, and it is something worrisome to the extent that he takes the issue of anarchy as an ideal seriously. And again, there's different paths to becoming an anarchist within the libertarian movement and arguments. I think some all wrong, some more understandable, and some more dishonest and badly motivated. I suspect that he's more on the side of it's wrong, but understandable. And the more you live in more corrupt governments, the more it can seem like, oh, it'd be better, even like no government would be better than this. I don't even think that's true in Argentina as it exists now. But if you're in a totalitarian system and you think, oh yeah, the government as such is evil, there's some plausibility to it. The position is still wrong in the end. And the more kind of you think of economics, politics, morality as a kind of rationalistic deduction, and you can see elements of that in the way Milei talks, the non-aggression principle, but the way it stands really for most libertarians, if they're making reference to this, they call it the non-aggression axiom. It's like this is a self-evident place from which you can start, that aggression is bad, non-aggression is the ideal. It's often a kind of pacifism that is meant in regard to that. It's the way it's put in objectivism is that the initiation of physical force is evil. That is a complex conclusion of all kinds of things, of deeper issues in philosophy about the nature of knowledge, the nature of human life, the nature of moral values. The idea that it's self-evident in a starting point, it's not. And if you knew anything about history and philosophy, it would be obvious to you that this is not a starting point. There's plenty of people who think you should use force if you're actually interested in achieving the good, that you should use force. And so the idea that, oh, it's self-evident that force is evil is you don't understand philosophy and morality. But if you have it that it's an axiom from which you can deduce things, and it's self-evident, you can get all kinds of conclusions that defy the facts. But your whole process is, no, but what it looks like to think is I've got axioms and it's like mathematics, trying to transplant it into a realm that it doesn't apply. The more that's the view, it's still wrong, but it's not so much just a hatred of the state. And for Milei, part of what's mixed about it, I think, in regard just to thinking, like, how does anarchism fit into the way he thinks about the world, is that he's pro the free countries. He's pro-Israel, he's pro the West, and often the anarchists who I think are motivated by hatred of the state, a desire to destroy. I think Murray Rothbard is like this. They hate the Western countries above all, and the U.S. is the representative of free countries. They want to tear down the U.S. government, and it will carry over to. We saw it in regard to Ukraine. You see it some in regard to Israel. It's to tear down these free countries and their governments. That's not what Milei projects. It's not what he's said, and that makes one think, or at least it makes me think, that it is his views about anarchism are more on the rationalistic side than on a motivation just by hatred of the state as such. And I view that as a better, again, mistaken, and would be destructive if put into practice. But it's the better side versus being motivated by just a desire to tear down government because it's government.
I think a natural need in a country like Argentina is not less rule of law, but actual rule of law. The government does a semi-credible job of protecting rights. So I think that would be an interesting barometer of how things are going. If he's really cutting elements of the state that are necessary to its proper function, that would be a really worrisome signal about how his ideas are shaping his approach. Because from what I've heard, it's the level of corruption maybe is not unusual for that part of the world, but it's significant. And I think it's harder to disentangle what the government should be doing from all the different ways in which it definitely feels like it's stealing from you, oppressing you, and standing in your way. And I think it's easier to do that at a remove. So I think it's
Yes,
worth looking
and
at.
even if it was so, it would be worse if it's there's sort of a dismantling of the legal system because it's government. But even if there's just neglect of it, so the focus is on um, uh, undermining, dismantling controls that should be undermined and dismantled, and no focus on, but what we need is actual rule of law. And what does it take to have that? And how do we build that? If there's just not a focus on that, that it's all about dismantling, you won't get rule of law. Rule of law is a real positive, it's an achievement, and you have to be focused on it. So it's not just like a solution to corrupt government officials, a corrupt judiciary isn't just get rid of that. It's you have to get good judges, and you have to get a functioning political system. And if there's just not a focus on that, because, well, after all, anarchy is the ideal, so we don't need government, that would be destructive as well. And that's a part of the reason why this that he will talk of anarchy as an ideal, and he'll put it as anarcho-capitalism, which I view as a contradiction in terms. Capitalism requires a government that defines, secures, and protects individual rights. When you don't have that, you have anarchy. You don't have, and if one thing you have or could have is anarchy if you have no government. But so there's no such thing as anarcho-capitalism. But if that's a kind of ideal, it's again, to the extent that that is impacting his political policies, program, how he approaches, and so on, that is something to be very worried about.
In the interview that happened at the conference, he a number of times mentions journalists by name. I don't know who they are, how prominent they are, but I imagine that they're thorns in his side, or at least I felt that way. And I was troubled by that, and partly because I think it's one thing if you're a candidate and you pick a fight with journalists and you don't really have the power of the state. You don't have it, you haven't been elected. But once you're the head of the state, you have significant power, and the statements you make can be read as not just dismissal, criticism, or annoyance, but they can be read as threats or tacit threats. And that when I heard that in the interview a number of times, I was really worried because I think I don't have a view of what Argentinians media space looks like and what the press is and how effective it is and how whether there's any corruption. And I imagine it's a mess, but I don't know enough to comment on that. But I think it's insofar as it's free, it's a really distressing fact that he goes after journalists, and I think he also does this on Twitter. This is part of what is part of his signature. He rails against people he doesn't like, and I just want to get your reaction to that, because to me that has authoritarian undertones, at least, if not more than that, or it could become something along those lines. So I regard the free press as sacrosanct. And even if they're doing a bad job, which is, in my view, most of the time here in the United States, I think it's important that there not be threats against free expression, free press in particular. I just want to know, how did you experience that when you listened to the interview?
Yeah, I have a similar reaction. So one, that I don't know all the specifics of what he's talking about and the journalist and what they've written. But what you said about making a distinction between, as a political candidate, you can really complain about or rail against certain journalists if you think what they're reporting is biased and sort of meant to paint you in the worst possible light. I mean, that can affect your ability to be elected. So you can really push back. And I think candidates should, when if they think the coverage of them is very unfair and is not actually presenting to the wider newspaper reading public or media consuming public what their actual positions are, what they're saying. That's a real detriment to getting elected. But once you're, and here he's head of state, in the executive branch, you have to be very careful about going after the media, because does it mean just you sort of as a political candidate are complaining about coverage, or you're going to use the executive power of government to now go after the media that you don't like? And so the issue of a free press is very important, and it one president of a nation should go out of their way to say, I respect, and even like can say there's certain coverage of me that I think is very biased, unfair, but I'm still on the side of a free press. And you really have to make that clear. And that, one might think that's kind of political fantasy, but it's not. And you don't have to go that far back to see that. I'm reading right now a little bit about World War II and some of about the war and some of its aftermath. And I mean, according to one of the books I was reading, Eisenhower met with the German press after Germany has fallen and it's being, I mean, it eventually gets divided into West Germany, East Germany, and said, we respect a free press, and you can criticize me, and you should when you think I'm doing something wrong. I'm not always going to agree with you, and so on, but we're on the side of a free press here. And I mean, the book put it as the German media was like, what is this? Because they were used to what it was like under the Nazis and Hitler, and you couldn't say anything. So, and like, or is he even serious about that? But the Americans were serious about that. If you're going to build a free or at least a semi-free country, is what West Germany became, you have to be able to make that kind of distinction between, I'm not going to agree with everything the press says, and I might even think that some of them are being really unfair and unjust. But that's very different than thinking that, oh, well, then we shouldn't have a free press. And it's part of the executive, as head of the executive branch, you have to make that crystal clear.
So there are a few more topics I want to talk about. Before we get to those, I just want to acknowledge and thank those of you who have contributed through Super Chat, your questions. We'll try to get to some questions. We'll see how we're doing for time. Thank you for your support, for the work that we're doing, and for watching live today. So let's get back to a couple of other points that I think are really important. And let me start with this one. So this one maybe we can do more briefly than the others that are coming up. But one of the things he says near the end of the conversation, the interview, is I think I take it as an admonishment to people who are supportive of him, and particularly those in the libertarian space, the free market space in Argentina and maybe in Latin America broadly, to not criticize him too harshly. And I think some of it, what he says, is to set expectations for what he can accomplish, what he can't accomplish, and to know that there are constraints, and just remember that. And before we started today's podcast, you were saying that one way you could take that is he's come to understand that it's a really difficult job, and there are a lot of things you can't control as a politician. I'm sure that's a big part of what he's experiencing. There's aspects of that I think there's more to it though that's worth commenting on. And I when I heard that comment, and he brings it up a couple of times, not just at the end. I think it's sprinkled earlier in the interview as well. It rubbed me the wrong way, and I was reflecting on why that is. And I think part of the reason is he's understandably trying to forestall criticisms of people that he expects to be supportive of him, but there's something about that is just doesn't make sense, because he should want to hear where he's falling short, if those are valid criticisms, right? I mean, I want to hear that when I'm getting things wrong, and I want to hear that whether it's from colleagues or from people who are hearing my work or listening or reading my work. And I want to do that because I want to get things right. I want to be on the right side of an issue, not just I want to be seen to be right, or supported by the people who I think should support me. And there's something really significantly different between wanting to be right and getting at the truth and getting at the right issues versus wanting support from a particular community. I'm curious how you thought of that aspect of the interview.
Yes, this was something emphasized near the end of it. As you said, it came up in passing, more in passing, I think, other times in the interview, but it comes up as a kind of focus at the end. And I thought my reaction to it was, there's something right here and there's something wrong. That is something importantly right and something deeply wrong. And one has to distinguish the two. What's importantly right is he's elected with the winning the popular vote, and I think he won 23 of the 24 regions that have governors in Argentina. So there's a real winning of the popular vote, but the party still it's a minority party in terms of seats. It has to negotiate, try to build some coalition. It has to reach some kind of compromises with other people if it's to pass various parts of the reform agenda. And that includes the formation of government, of people that he's appointed to it, as positions, ministers, and so on. That there's a lot of compromise and negotiation that goes on in regard to that. There's something right when it's not essentially right, but there's something right when people say politics is the art of compromise. It's in a system like this, he can't just do it, and you wouldn't want a system where just, okay, there's one elected ruler, now he can just do whatever he wants. And so he has to work within the system, which it means including the different parties and so on. That's a complicated, difficult thing to do. And it's easy to criticize from the outside, saying, well, why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do that? So, yeah, from the reality of what is actually going on, it may have been impossible to reach any kind of negotiated agreement like that. And I think I got the sense that like that's part of what he's experiencing, and it's more difficult than one might think from the outside. And I think it's important any criticism be made in that context of real thinking about what's possible in the situation. And but the outcome of that is, don't criticize me. Like that, it can't be that's so because it's difficult, you're immune to or beyond criticism. That's crazy to think that. But the criticism has to be informed criticism, rational criticism, not a kind of fantasy. Well, like if things were completely different and you could wave your magic wand, why don't you do that? Well, you can't do that in the actual situation. And what came up in the end is um, people who think of themselves as allied on the side of freedom, libertarians, they shouldn't criticize. It's true they shouldn't criticize baselessly, without reason and evidence. But if there's actual things to criticize, as you were saying, it's one should view that as helpful. That it's like they're actually interested in accomplishing the goals and accomplishing a kind of economic, let's take the economic issues, economic reform in Argentina. They care about that, and they think you're taking some missteps. So, and it's not just they have a right to criticize; they should criticize if what it amounts to is constructive, informed criticism. That should be viewed as a positive, not a negative. And there was too much of an element that it seemed like, no, like I just want people to say they agree. I just want them on board. So that's and that there's some authoritarian overtones and element. That's what an authoritarian wants. I want your agreement with whether you think I'm doing what's right or wrong. I want you to go along. And again, for someone who's a head of state, that's not a proper position. And so it had that element to it. And I mean, that's just on the economic issues. But if there's then things that are being proposed in regard to banning abortion, a military draft, for sure he should be criticized and strongly criticized for that. And it might even be for people like, yeah, that causes me to lose any support I have for him. So it can't be that he's beyond or immune to criticism.
Yeah, I agree with that. Part of what I was reacting to, and I think it's there, is an implied call for solidarity and loyalty. And one way this comes up is he warns people listening, you will see people trying to flip or convert libertarians to become my enemies, and just don't fall for that. They're going to try to use them against me. And again, this is through an interpreter, so I don't know exactly how he's presenting it in the original Spanish, but it came across as a call for the wrong kind of solidarity, the wrong kind of loyalty, which I think, again, is, as you was describing it, it's really worrisome and something to challenge. And I think that's the responsibility of anyone who values freedom to do. Let's turn to a couple of final points before we draw close. We're over time, but I think it's important to get to these topics. So I think of these as points that Milei brings up. He brings it up or it comes up in the interview. It has come up in other of his statements. And for people who have some awareness of Ayn Rand or familiarity with Ayn Rand's views, I think there will be a question of how much influence has she had on his thinking, how much does his position resemble hers, is there a difference? And so let's talk about these two that have come up. One is about his view of business leaders as heroes. So this comes up in his speech at Davos, and it's put to him as a question at the interview in Buenos Aires at the conference. And in the interview, he is asked to elaborate on this. And what I take from his comments is that he sees them as social benefactors, as making each of our lives better by producing better quality goods at cheaper prices, and in the end, an improvement across the board for society. And one reason I wanted to bring this up is it's hard to get enough of what he thinks from those statements, and at the same time, it's easy to read into what he's saying a better view than he has. And so my assumption is that his view is likely the kind of collectivized utilitarian view that you hear a lot of American conservatives talk about, which is that the free market lifts all boats, right? It's a tide that lifts all boats. It makes everyone better off, and that's not a merely factual statement, which I agree with. It's a moral claim that this is the reason it's good. And I think the question is his claim about business leaders a factual statement, which I think Ayn Rand would agree with? And she's said things that are basically similar to that business leaders are benefactors. But that's not the justification for leaving them to be free. It's not a justification for the system of capitalism on moral terms. So I'm curious how you understand that, and is there more that can be said about what we can tell about Millei's view on this issue?
I have part of my perspective here is having read some of the economists who he's reading and citing, and having been around libertarians who are economists, or like that's their profession, and economics in some sense is their profession, so the more economically oriented of them. And it's I think it's too strong to put it they're straight out collectivists, but it's also not right to say they're individualist. If individualism means crucially moral individualism, so it doesn't only mean that, but part of what individualism is, it's you view morality not just from the perspective of the individual, but as the essence of morality is teaching the individual how to live, prosper, be happy. So, in the words of the Declaration of Independence, it's about the pursuit of happiness, but it's the individual's own pursuit of happiness. They're not moral individualists in that sense, that because in that sense, it's they have to break with altruism that says no, but morality is not about really about you, it's about other people, it's about serving their needs, advancing their lives. Utilitarianism says you can count yourself as one among the million or the billion, but it's the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And if it so happens that you could advance other like a great amount of happiness but suffer yourself and your life won't go well, and so that's morally what you should do. So that um, moral viewpoint is entrenched right now in Western thought, Western ideas, and they absorb that. But they have an element of individualism, and that the economics is it's individuals producing and getting better. And it's true, all the individuals who are eager and willing to work and produce and have to take the responsibility of being free, they can build a life in a free society under capitalism. And you could see that there's both, even in this interview, you could see both elements of it, that a kind of justification that that's more utilitarian collectivist, everybody will be better off. And so that's actually not true under capitalism. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But you also saw a kind of more individualist perspective, but it would never be put explicitly and morally in this way by most of them. And I think Milei falls into this camp or category. But he had like a businessman is what they're trying to do is he had something like buy low and sell high. They're trying to minimize if you're running a restaurant, you're minimizing your cost. You still want to produce something that your customers value, want to buy, but you're like if you can reduce how much your raw materials are, vegetables and meat you're buying and so on, but it's still good quality. That's what you do in order to you're trying to maximize the profits. But he said, and this is what workers do too, which is true. That a worker, when you're negotiating your salary, thinking of changing jobs and so on, it's who's going to pay me the most? You're trying to maximize the salary you're going to get. And in terms of your expenses, you're trying to minimize that. Like, can I find a cheaper place to live? A different car to drive that will be, it has fewer repairs or is more fuel efficient. So my costs are low and my income is as high as it can be. And in that sense, you're doing like this is what people do under capitalism. And that's you're looking after yourself, trying to advance your life, and if you're doing that, then you're going to try to maximize your income or revenue and minimize your costs, and that's true, and that's part of what happens under a market. And so many of these the economists will have a view, and Ayn Rand commented on this, that they know at some level when you're looking at the level of individuals, this is what individuals are doing, but we can't justify the whole system like this. That well, it enables individuals to do this if this is what they want to do. And so you can, if you're willing to work and produce and trade, you can build a life for yourself. It's no, we have to have some kind of social collective justification, because that's what morality really is about. And so there's a way in which they have a foot in both worlds. And it undermines their position. It's contradictory. Opponents sense that it's like, well, but is the justification individualist or collectivist? If it's individualist, well, we know that's wrong, and that's where selfishness and the profit motive lead. And so if they say that, they'll be attacked. And if they say no, the justification is really collectivist, well, we're the real collectivists here. So why don't you follow us? Not and that like it. So it's you have a foot in both worlds. It's a contradictory, impossible position, but it's not through and through collectivism. And I think that's the flavor I get in listening to Milei. He fits that mold.
Did you want to say something about why capitalism doesn't benefit everyone? I can't remember exactly how you put that point, but there's a
Yeah.
qualification
So
that you wanted to raise.
and this Milei has a sense of this, and this is again, there's a individualist aspect of this. Um, he has a perspective that you're not going to convince hardcore socialists. You're not, because what they're after is not prosperity. And it's not, if you point out to them and show them country after country, Venezuela, Cuba, look, every time socialism is implemented more, standard of livings go down, it's destruction, economic destruction and death. And you can point to the whole history of Argentina in regard to this. It doesn't convince them, because what they're after is not prosperity. And for that kind of person, it's not true that, oh, yeah, like you'd be better off if you lived in a capitalist system. If you're a power hungry and power luster, you want to live in an authoritarian system hoping that you're going to climb the mountain of tyrannical power so that you'll wield it over everyone. And it's, you can't say of this person, oh, but if you only understood capitalism, you'd be in favor of capitalism and see this is what advances your goals. No, that's not what my goals are. And it's Ayn Rand who really understood this point, and she points it out many times. So capitalism is the system in which a human being, if you want to live as a human being, as a producer and trader, it's the system in which you want to live. And in that sense, it's on the side of the good and on the side of values. But there's many people who rebel against that. And it's not like, oh, you can tell a Stalin, oh, you really should be on the side of capitalism because you'd lead a better life. That person, he can't lead a good life given what he's made of himself. But his whole viewpoint and emphasis is on, no, I want a system that crushes people. And it's important to recognize that. And it's part of why the collective justification of capitalism just plays into the hands of these power lusters.
You brought up the sort of motivations of the people who, the kind of Stalins of the world and others who've advocated for dominating others through political means. I want to pick up on another issue that Milei raises or brings up in a response that he gives during the interview, and this is his characterization of what animates socialism. So if I remember the question correctly, it's socialism has failed practically all over the place, across history, across continents. What accounts for its continuing popularity? Why do people continue to advocate for it? I think that's how he reformulates the question, and then he goes on to answer it. And part of what he says is socialism is a disease of the soul. I think that's the way it was interpreted by the translation. And he goes on to explain that it's an ideology that is a cover for a resentment, for people who are mediocre, for really low kinds of souls, in effect. So there's something, I take it as a primarily psychological account. And this is so the reason I bring this up is that this kind of analysis has, it might call to mind some of what Ayn Rand has to say about the idea of envy, which is not exactly envy, as she goes on to clarify. It's a kind of hatred of achievement and intelligence and of anything good, precisely because it is good and constitutes an achievement, which is a corrupt orientation, a corrupt motivation to have. And this is so there's points of seeming overlap here. And I just curious how you understood his point and how you see the relationship between his view and hers. Because listening to it, I thought there's something right about what he's saying. It's not exactly the full answer, I think, but there's something right here. And Ayn Rand has something more to say about what actually motivates socialism. It's not essentially psychological, though psychology goes into it. So I'm curious how you process that.
Yes, and I think this is likely one of the places that there's been some impact of Ayn Rand's thinking on how he's thinking about it, because I think this is part of Ayn Rand's impact on the wider kind of intellectual world that's interested in freedom. And so you can think of libertarians as part of this, that you'll get from Atlas Shrugged. This is central to the theme of Atlas Shrugged. It's what the main characters don't grasp at the start, and takes really like the whole book for them to fully grasp that there's people who are motivated in a evil way that goes deep down to the essence of what they've become. That they're, as you put it, that they're motivated by a desire to destroy values, achievement, good things, precisely because they recognize them as values, achievements, good things. It's to tear down. It's her. You can think of it. It's her analysis of what nihilism is. And it's in part psychological, but it's philosophical as well. And so part of what is very different in Ayn Rand's view is this is not confined to some collectivist, and it's not confined to the political level. It has deep philosophical roots, that she thinks of many philosophical systems as their cover for this kind of orientation or motivation. And they both help bring that kind of motivation into being, but also provide it the cover of intellectuality and morality. And she viewed, to just make this more concrete, she viewed Immanuel Kant as the most evil intellectual and most evil person in history, because she thinks of him as unleashing the people with this motivation. They now have philosophical and moral sanction, that their way of looking at the world and wanting to tear down achievement values, it's viewed as the what's to be current intellectually and to be the avant-garde. That's what you do. And she viewed him, he's tearing down reason, the source of all values and achievements, in the name of supposedly upholding reason. And that this was nihilism in his system. And if his system is taken seriously, which it was, and which he was trying to have it taken seriously, will unleash nihilism across the West. And I think that's what you've seen in going into the 20th century. It's not some 21st century phenomenon with the woke and so on. There's socialism, collectivism, communism as such should be seen as this form of nihilism, but much more broadly, everybody against the Enlightenment has a real element of this as their motivation. And that's, the Enlightenment is a philosophical achievement. So if you think of it like that, it's much broader and deeper than politics. And it's hard for people to wrap their head around this. I mean, it just that there could be this unleashing of evil But on the other hand, it was hard for people to wrap their head around how did the West descend into World War One and World War Two? How did the Holocaust happen and so on? And the Ayn Rand's perspective is you can't understand this if you don't think philosophically and understand what is happening at the philosophical level. And in regard to Nazism and Hitler, you can read Dr. Peikoff's Ayn Rand students, the ominous parallels, which goes into elaborate detail on the philosophy that unleashed this nihilistic horror. But Ayn Rand saw this in religion, and like when Christianity held power, you could see this motivation in many religious figures. So it's, and she thinks of it as it's involved, crucially involved in altruism. So there's a sense that I think Milei has. He's right that there's people like this in the world. He's wrong in the way that I think he's thinking of it in he doesn't have right who actually falls into this category, how widespread it is, and which doctrines give it cover.
Yeah, I think it definitely the idea that it's only socialism that has this, I think, is in the contemporary space, it's just mistaken, quite clearly mistaken and narrow view. But it's interesting if we've talked about other ways in which there might be influence from Ayn Rand on him, looking for points of similarity, points of difference when we were thinking about this event. And this is an interesting one because I wonder if it's a direct influence from his reading Ayn Rand, and I don't know if he's read any of Ayn Rand, or if it's through an echo through someone else whose views are influenced by Ayn Rand. One of the economists that you mentioned, I don't know how much, or just people he's met and encountered. And so to me, this is a topic we've talked about in other podcasts recently, but the idea of influence is just very rich, and I think it's easy to overlook the ways in which it operates and to treat it as a binary on-off switch, and that it's all or nothing. And also the way knowledge works and how it takes effort to integrate new knowledge, and particularly new work that you want to influence you, as opposed to letting knowledge influence you passively, which is another phenomenon too that Ayn Rand talks about. All right, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've gone over time. Let's draw a close here. Any final thoughts on your part? I want to share my perspective, which we started with, which is the goals we had for this interview event, which it was supposed to be something more of a conversation and intellectual engagement with someone of particular interest. If that didn't happen, the interview, I think, in some ways, for me, was disappointment, even based on the goals of the interview. And I think one of the goals I had in our having this discussion is just to bring out some of the what would have been good to talk about had he been in the room and open to more of an engagement, which we have to acknowledge he was asked if he would do the conversation with Iran, and he wasn't open to that, and he wanted to do an interview instead, and that's what happened. So it's relevant that he had a part in the way it unfolded. So yeah, basically a disappointment. I think it was a missed opportunity, but a lot of interesting things that could have happened and worth thinking about. Even now that this has happened, things to look at what he does when he's in power and how he runs Argentina from now on.
Yeah, and just to echo what you said in a different way, it's I what I started with is that if you watch just that interview, and it will come across as we're endorsing Milei as a political candidate. And part of what we talked about today is there's real positives there that one should think about evaluating. There's negatives and real negatives, and part of an assessment then is to think of all that together and to think partly it's including how he's thinking about these issues, what is his political agenda, and that takes real analysis. And that's the kind of thinking. And if you're in Argentina and voting, so this is what you have to be thinking about. And the one of the points, to put it in a little different way, um, don't be tribal. So it's not true that to support a political candidate means you can't say anything negative about the candidate. You can't worry about some of the things they're doing. That you should be doing this wide awake, looking at everything in order to reach an informed assessment.
Yeah, just to amplify your observation that you started with and that you brought back to this conclusion, it might look as if the effect of the interview might be that it looks as if we are endorsing him. We don't endorse candidates. We haven't, and we won't ever do that. It's not part of our mission. And what I would say about the interview itself is that there's many more things to say about what didn't go well and what did go well. But we'll leave it here to focus on the core philosophic points that I think are important to stress. And I think there's interesting things for us to learn as an organization about how we do events like this. If we do events like this again, and I wasn't thrilled about it when we were planning it, and I think there were a lot of challenges in the process, and I think there's more to reflect on here. But I'm glad we had this opportunity to debrief some of what happened in the interview. All right. Well, thanks for being with us today. Thank you for the super chat contributions and for being with us live today and for your questions. We didn't really get time to talk about them. We are over time as it is, so we'll try to keep them for another occasion if it comes up. And with that, we'll close. We'll see you all next time. Thanks.